December 14th, 2023, 5:47 a.m. Arctic Circle, Northern Alaska.
When 68-year-old Henrik pushed open his cabin door that frozen morning, just as the world lay silent under the eternal darkness of polar night, he found two tiny white wolf pups dying on his snow-covered porch. If stories of impossible bonds between man and wild move you, subscribe to Arctic Wolf Legends. Now, let's begin. Henrik knew the rules: never interfere with Arctic wildlife. But watching them freeze to death wasn't something his conscience could bear, especially not during the darkest days of winter, when survival itself hung by a thread. What happened next would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wild. It was barely dawn in the frozen wilderness, though in December, dawn was nothing more than a dim grey suggestion against endless black. Henrik, a former wildlife biologist in his late 60s, had been living alone in his remote cabin for 17 years, deep in the heart of Alaska's most unforgiving territory, where temperatures regularly dropped to -40 degrees. He'd been dozing in his worn leather chair, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, when something cut through the howling wind, a sound that didn't belong, a faint, desperate whimpering that pierced the thick log walls like a knife through silence. His eyes snapped open. He sat perfectly still, listening. The wind screamed around the cabin, rattling the shutters. But there it was again, thin, high-pitched, barely audible above the storm, a cry for help. Henrik moved carefully, his joints stiff from the cold and age. He grabbed his heavy parka from the hook near the door and pulled it on, his breath already forming clouds in the frigid air inside the cabin. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to embers, and the temperature had dropped significantly during the night. He approached the door slowly, each step deliberate. Something in that cry triggered his old instincts, the ones he'd developed during 3 decades of studying Arctic wildlife, before he'd retreated to this isolated existence. The door resisted as he pulled. Ice had formed along the frame overnight. He yanked harder, and it finally gave way with a crack of breaking ice. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He squinted against the driving snow, his eyes watering instantly in the brutal cold. Right there on his porch, barely visible against the white landscape, sat a wolf pup. Henrik's heart stopped. The creature was tiny, no bigger than a small dog, its white fur already crusted with ice crystals that caught what little light existed in the pre-dawn darkness. Its ears were pressed flat against its skull, and its body trembled with violent shivers that shook its entire frame. The pup's eyes were barely open, glazed with exhaustion and cold. It wasn't making a sound anymore. It simply sat there, swaying slightly, as if every ounce of energy had been spent just reaching this point. Henrik stood frozen, his mind racing through protocols, wildlife regulations, safety measures. Arctic wolves were protected. They were also dangerous, even the young ones. Interfering could mean serious legal trouble, not to mention the risk if the mother was nearby. But as he watched, the pup's head drooped forward, and it nearly toppled sideways into the snow. His training vanished. Instinct took over. He knelt down carefully, extending one gloved hand toward the trembling creature. The pup didn't react, didn't even lift its head. Henrik could see its chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Hypothermia, advanced stages. Then he saw movement beyond the porch, down in the snow-covered yard. A second pup. God almighty, Henrik breathed, his voice swallowed by the wind. This one was in worse shape. It was barely moving, dragging itself through snow that was deeper than the pup was tall. Each movement was agonizingly slow, as if lifting one paw required every last bit of strength the creature possessed. Henrik didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed the first pup gently but firmly, surprised by how light it felt in his hands despite its thick fur. The pup's body was frighteningly cold, even through his heavy gloves. He carried it inside quickly, kicking the door partially closed behind him to keep some heat in. He set the first pup down on the rug near the stove, then immediately rushed back outside. The wind had picked up even more, and visibility was dropping fast. Snow swirled in violent eddies across the clearing. The second pup had stopped moving entirely. It lay in the snow about 15 feet from the porch, its white fur making it almost invisible against the frozen landscape. Only the small depression around it and the faint rise and fall of its ribcage indicated it was still alive. Henrik trudged through the deep snow, feeling the cold penetrate even his insulated boots. He reached the pup and scooped it up as gently as he could. This one was even colder than the first, its body almost rigid with hypothermia. Its eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment, Henrik thought it might already be too late. But then he felt it, the faintest whisper of breath against his gloved hand. He turned and pushed back through the snow toward the cabin, moving as fast as he dared. The wind fought him every step, trying to knock him off balance. By the time he reached the door, his lungs burned from the cold air, and ice had formed in his beard. Inside, he kicked the door shut firmly and carried the second pup to join its sibling. He stripped off his frozen gloves and parka, hanging them near the stove to dry, then immediately got to work. Henrik moved with practiced efficiency, his scientific training kicking into gear. He grabbed clean towels from the bathroom, his emergency medical kit from under the kitchen sink, and a stack of wool blankets from the bedroom closet. He spread towels on the floor near the wood stove and carefully placed both pups on them, positioning them close enough to the heat source to warm them, but not so close they'd overheat. He opened the stove door and added fresh logs, stoking the fire until flames leaped and crackled, filling the small room with blessed warmth. The first pup, the one that had been sitting on the porch, had curled into a tight ball. Its eyes were open now, watching Henrik with a mixture of wariness and exhaustion. Good signs, Henrik thought. Awareness meant the hypothermia hadn't progressed to complete system shutdown. The second pup was more concerning. It lay completely still, eyes closed, barely breathing. Henrik gently ran his hands over its body, checking for injuries. Nothing obvious, no broken bones or wounds, just extreme cold exposure and exhaustion. He filled shallow bowls with lukewarm water, not too cold, not too hot, and placed them within reach of both pups. Then he began the careful process of warming them, using his hands to massage their small bodies, stimulating circulation, bringing life back to frozen limbs. Minutes stretched into an hour. Henrik talked to them constantly, his voice low and soothing, the way he used to talk to injured animals in his research days. "Come on, little ones, you're tough. Arctic wolves don't give up that easily." The first pup's shivers gradually decreased. It lifted its head slightly, sniffing the air, catching the scent of the water. With tremendous effort, it stretched its neck forward, and its tongue touched the edge of the bowl. It drank, small laps at first, then more eagerly. Henrik felt a surge of relief, so strong it almost brought tears to his eyes. "That's it," he encouraged. "Good, keep drinking." He turned his attention to the second pup, the one that worried him most. He picked it up carefully, cradling it against his chest, using his own body heat to warm it. He could feel its heart beating, rapid and weak, but steady. Time lost all meaning. Henrik sat there on the floor, back against the wall, holding one pup while watching the other. He replaced wet towels with dry ones as the ice and snow melted from their fur. He refreshed the water. He kept the fire roaring. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the second pup began to respond. Its breathing deepened. The violent shivers that had racked its tiny body gradually eased. And then, finally, its eyes fluttered open. Those eyes were pale amber, almost gold, and they fixed on Henrik's face with an intensity that took his breath away. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Henrik felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps, understanding, a connection that transcended species and survival instinct. The pup made a small sound, barely more than a whimper, then tucked its head against Henrik's chest and closed its eyes again. By midday, both pups were stable. Not healthy, not strong, but alive. They'd drunk water and even nibbled at some dried venison Henrik had shredded into tiny pieces. The first pup, the larger of the two, had even attempted to stand, wobbling on unsteady legs before collapsing back onto the towels. Henrik finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He made coffee, strong and black, and sat watching his unexpected guests from a few feet away. His late wife Maria would have loved this. She'd always said he had too soft a heart for a scientist, that his objectivity flew out the window the moment an animal was in distress. She'd been right, of course, she usually was. But as Henrik sat there in his warm cabin, watching two wolf pups who should have died but didn't, he wondered what price his compassion might exact. Where was their mother? Arctic wolves didn't abandon their young. Something catastrophic must have happened to separate these pups from their pack, and if the mother was still alive, she would be searching for them. She would follow their scent. She would come here. Henrik sipped his coffee and waited. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin, and darkness pressed against the windows like a living thing. The Arctic winter showed no mercy, not to man, not to beast. Survival here was a brutal equation, and Henrik had just altered the balance. He didn't have to wait long to find out what that meant. That evening, just after what passed for sunset in the polar darkness, around 2:30 p.m., Henrik heard it. A sound that made every hair on his body stand on end. Scratching. Soft, deliberate scratching at the back door. Henrik froze mid-sip, coffee cup halfway to his lips. The scratching came again, patient, insistent, not frantic or aggressive, almost polite. He set down his cup with trembling hands and moved silently to the kitchen window. What he saw through the frost-covered glass stopped his heart. An adult Arctic wolf stood in his backyard, massive and magnificent, her white fur pristine even in the storm. She was bigger than any wolf he'd studied in his career, easily 130 pounds of pure predator. Her breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and her eyes, those unmistakable amber eyes, glowed in the darkness as they reflected the cabin's light. She was staring directly at the door. Waiting. Henrik's scientific mind raced through calculations. An adult female Arctic wolf could bite with over 1,500 pounds of pressure per square inch. She could tear through his door if she wanted to. She could kill him in seconds. But she wasn't trying to break in. She was asking. From the living room, the pups made soft mewling sounds. They'd heard their mother. They knew she was there. Henrik stood at that window for a full minute, maybe more, watching the wolf watch him. He could see her ribs pressing against her fur. She was thin, dangerously so, starving, and exhausted, her legs trembling slightly as she stood in the deep snow. Something had happened to this pack, something terrible. Making possibly the most reckless decision of his life, Henrik moved to the back door. His hand hesitated on the handle. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to lock the doors, to call for help. Instead, he turned the handle and cracked the door. Door opened about 6 inches. The wind rushed in, and with it, the scent of wild things, pine and snow, and something ancient. The wolf didn't lunge, didn't snarl. She simply stood there, her golden eyes fixed on Henrik's face, and in that moment, he understood. She wasn't here to attack, she was here to retrieve her children. But she was too weak to fight for them, too exhausted to force her way in. She was placing herself at his mercy, trusting a human because she had no other choice. Henrik stepped back from the door, pulling it open wider. "Come on then," he said quietly. "They're safe. They're warm." The wolf hesitated for just a second, her nostrils flaring as she assessed the situation. Then, with movements that were surprisingly graceful, despite her obvious exhaustion, she stepped through the doorway into the cabin. She was enormous up close. Her head came up to Henrik's chest, and when she passed him, he could feel the heat radiating from her body, see the ice crystals clinging to her fur. She moved directly toward the living room, following the sound and scent of her pups, completely ignoring Henrik as if he'd ceased to exist. Henrik closed the door behind her and followed at a safe distance, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. In the living room, the reunion was instant and overwhelming. The mother wolf rushed to her pups, and they scrambled toward her on unsteady legs, whimpering and crying with joy. She circled them frantically, sniffing every inch of their bodies, licking their faces, checking for injuries. When she was satisfied they were unharmed, she collapsed onto the towels and pulled both pups against her, wrapping her body around them protectively. They burrowed into her warmth, and within seconds, all three were pressed together in a tangle of white fur. The mother wolf's eyes closed, and her entire body seemed to sag with relief. Henrik stood in the doorway, hardly daring to breathe. He'd just allowed a wild apex predator into his home. If anyone found out, he'd lose his research credentials, face massive fines, possibly jail time. But watching this mother reunite with her babies, seeing the pure, desperate love in every movement, he knew he'd made the right choice. "You're safe here," he whispered. "All of you." The mother wolf's eyes opened slowly. She looked at Henrik, really looked at him, with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Then, incredibly, she lowered her head back to her pups and closed her eyes again. Trust. She was showing him trust. Henrik backed away carefully and returned to the kitchen. He pulled out the last of his venison supply, about 3 pounds of meat he'd been saving, and placed it on a large ceramic plate. He filled a second bowl with fresh water, then carried both into the living room, setting them down about 6 feet from where the wolves lay. The mother's eyes tracked his every movement, but she didn't raise her head or show any sign of aggression. "Whenever you're ready," Henrik said softly. "No rush." He retreated to his chair and picked up a book, pretending to read while secretly watching the wolves from the corner of his eye. An hour passed, then 2. The mother wolf didn't move, just kept her pups wrapped in her warmth, occasionally licking their faces or adjusting her position to cover them more completely. Finally, as evening deepened into night, she carefully extracted herself from the sleeping pups. She moved toward the food Henrik had left, her movements cautious but not fearful. She sniffed the venison thoroughly, then looked back at Henrik once more. He kept his eyes on his book, giving her space. She ate, not frantically, but deliberately, tearing into the meat with careful precision. She drank deeply from the water bowl. When she'd finished, she returned to her pups, licked them gently to wake them, and guided them to the remaining food. Henrik watched as the pups ate, their tiny jaws working at the shredded meat. The larger one, the first he'd found, ate aggressively, tail wagging slightly. The smaller one was more hesitant, but with encouragement from its mother's nose, it eventually joined in. When they'd finished, the mother herded them back to the warm spot near the stove, curled around them again, and within minutes, all 3 were asleep. Henrik sat in his chair, book forgotten in his lap, and watched the Arctic night deepen outside his windows. The storm was intensifying. Weather reports before he'd lost radio signal had predicted a major system moving in, the kind that could bury his cabin for days. He was trapped here, with 3 Arctic wolves. His food supply was dwindling, and nobody knew where he was or what he'd done. But as he watched the mother wolf breathe deeply in sleep, her pups tucked safely against her, Henrik felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years of isolation. Purpose. The blizzard hit with full force just after midnight. Henrik woke to the sound of wind screaming around the cabin with such violence that the entire structure shook. Snow hammered against the windows like millions of tiny fists, and even the thick log walls couldn't block out the fury of the Arctic, expressing its rage. He got up immediately, checking the stove, adding more wood. The temperature inside the cabin had already dropped several degrees. This was going to be a bad one. In the living room, the wolves were awake too. The mother stood guard near her pups, her ears pricked forward, listening to the storm. When Henrik entered, she watched him but didn't move or show any sign of alarm. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Henrik told her, as if she could understand. Maybe she could, in her way. He spent the next hour reinforcing the cabin. He stuffed towels along the window frames to block drafts, checked the chimney flue, and brought in his entire woodpile from the covered porch. They might be stuck here for days, possibly weeks. The mother wolf observed everything he did, with keen intelligence. Once, When he passed too close to her pups, she tensed slightly, but she didn't growl or bare her teeth, just watched. By dawn, if the dim grey suggestion of light could be called dawn, the cabin was almost completely buried. Snow had piled up against the walls, to the point where Henrik could barely see out the windows. The wind continued its relentless assault. Henrik established a routine that would sustain them through the siege. He kept the fire burning constantly, melting snow for extra water, carefully rationing his remaining food supplies. He'd been planning a supply run to the nearest town, about 40 miles away, but that was impossible now. The wolves seemed to understand they were in for a long stay. The mother began to relax incrementally, hour by hour. By the second day of the storm, she no longer tensed when Henrik moved around the cabin. By the third day, she allowed him to pass within a few feet of her pups without reaction. Henrik continued to provide food, sharing his supplies equally. He placed the food at regular intervals, always at the same spot, creating routine and predictability. He spoke to them constantly, his voice low and calm, narrating his actions. Just checking the stove now, adding more wood, getting more water. The pups grew stronger daily. Their eyes brightened, their movements became more confident. The larger pup, which Henrik privately named Kaiser, began exploring the cabin, sniffing everything with insatiable curiosity. The smaller one, more cautious, stayed closer to its mother, but even it ventured out occasionally. On the fourth morning, something remarkable happened. Henrik was sitting in his chair, drinking coffee and watching the storm still raging outside, when he felt something touch his leg. He looked down to find Kaiser sitting beside him, looking up with those pale amber eyes. Slowly, carefully, Henrik extended his hand. Kaiser sniffed it thoroughly, then did something that made Henrik's throat tight. The pup pressed its small head against Henrik's palm just for a moment before trotting back to its mother. Henrik sat there, his hands still outstretched, feeling the warmth where the pup had touched him. Maria had been right. He did have too soft a heart. The storm finally broke on the fifth day. Henrik woke to silence, true silence, the kind that only comes after days of relentless wind. He rushed to the window and cleared the frost from the glass. Sunlight. Actual, genuine sunlight, the first he'd seen in weeks. The world outside was transformed, buried under several feet of fresh snow, but peaceful, beautiful. The storm had passed. He turned to tell the wolves, but the living room was empty. Henrik's heart dropped into his stomach. He rushed through the cabin, checking every room, but he already knew. The back door was slightly ajar, though he'd closed it the night before. In the fresh snow outside, he could see them. Tracks. 4 paws and 2 smaller sets, leading away from the cabin toward the tree line. They were gone. Henrik stood in the doorway, the cold morning air washing over him, and stared at those tracks until his eyes blurred. They'd left during the night, slipping away while he slept, returning to their world. Of course they had. They were wild. They'd never been his to keep. He stepped outside into the pristine snow and knelt down, his fingers tracing the outline of the mother wolf's paw print. It was enormous, larger than his hand, and right beside it, 2 tiny prints, already being filled by wind-blown snow. "Stay safe," he whispered to the empty wilderness. "All of you." He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the snow until the cold forced him back inside. The cabin felt emptier than it had in 17 years, emptier than it had felt even after Maria died. But as Henrik closed the door and turned back to his solitary life, he noticed something. The ceramic plate where he'd left food was licked completely clean. The water bowl was empty, and on the towels where the wolves had slept, he found tufts of white fur, soft as down, catching the morning light. They'd been real. It had all been real. Henrik gathered the fur carefully, placing it in a small wooden box Maria had made years ago. Then he set about cleaning the cabin, removing all evidence of his wild guests, preparing to return to normal. But he knew, deep in his bones, that nothing would ever be normal again. He'd crossed a line. He'd touched something wild and ancient, and the wilderness, in its own way, had touched him back. What he didn't know yet was that the story was far from over. The wolves had left him something more than memories and shed fur. They'd left him a debt. And in the Arctic, debts were always repaid. Winter's grip on the Arctic loosened slowly, reluctantly, like a predator unwilling to release its prey. March arrived with marginally longer days, though true warmth wouldn't come for months. Henrik fell back into his solitary routines, chopping wood, maintaining his equipment, reading the same books he'd read dozens of times before. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. The cabin felt wrong now, too quiet, too empty. He found himself standing at the back door frequently, staring out at the tree line, searching for white shapes moving through the forest. He never saw them. The wolves had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. But Henrik knew they were out there. Somewhere in those millions of acres of frozen wilderness, they were hunting, surviving, living their wild lives. He wondered if they remembered him. He wondered if they thought about those 5 days in the cabin the way he did, constantly, obsessively. Probably not. They were animals. They lived in the present, not in memory. Still, he looked for them. April brought the first real thaw. Ice began breaking up in the streams, and patches of dark earth appeared where snow melted on sun-exposed slopes. Henrik started taking longer walks, exploring areas he'd neglected during the brutal winter months. He was a trained observer, and he noticed things most people would miss. A track here, too large to be a fox. A scat deposit there, definitely canine. Tufts of white fur caught on low branches. Signs of wolves moving through his territory. Were they his wolves, or just the resident pack passing through? He couldn't tell, but the signs gave him hope, a strange, warm feeling in his chest that he hadn't felt since Maria died. One afternoon in late April, Henrik decided to push further than usual. There was a ridge about 3 miles from his cabin, a steep climb that offered spectacular views of the valley. He'd been meaning to check it out for months, but had put it off. Today felt right. He packed light: water, emergency supplies, his satellite phone that rarely had signal, and a walking stick he'd carved years ago. The day was clear, temperature just above freezing, perfect hiking weather. The climb was harder than he remembered. His legs weren't what they used to be, and his breath came in harsh gasps as he navigated the steep terrain. But the view from the top was worth it. He could see for miles, endless wilderness stretching in every direction, pristine and untouched. He sat on a flat rock, drinking water and catching his breath, feeling more at peace than he had in weeks. That's when everything went wrong. Henrik stood up to begin his descent, but the moment his boot touched the ground, he knew he'd made a mistake. The rock was loose, unstable. It shifted under his weight. "Shit!" he gasped, arms windmilling as he tried to catch his balance. He couldn't. Gravity took over. Henrik went down hard, his body slamming against the rocky slope. He tumbled, bouncing off boulders and exposed roots, unable to stop himself. His walking stick flew from his hand. His backpack tore free. Everything became a blur of pain and motion, and the sickening certainty that this was how he was going to die. He crashed into a tree about 20 feet down the slope, and the impact drove all the air from his lungs. Stars exploded across his vision. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only lie there, gasping like a fish on dry land. When the world finally stopped spinning, the pain hit. His left leg. Oh God, his left leg. Henrik looked down and immediately wished he hadn't. His ankle was bent at an angle that was completely, horrifyingly wrong. The bone hadn't broken through the skin, but he could see the bulge where it had fractured, pressing against his hiking boot. A sound escaped his throat, something between a groan and a scream. He tried to move, tried to stand, but the moment he put any weight on the leg, agony exploded through his entire body. White-hot, blinding pain that made his vision blur and his stomach heave. "No, no, no," he panted, collapsing back against the tree trunk. He was 3 miles from his cabin. His phone was in his backpack, which was somewhere up the slope. The temperature was dropping as the sun sank lower. He was injured, alone, and completely screwed. Henrik forced himself to take deep breaths, fighting back panic. He'd been in bad situations before. He'd survived grisly encounters, whiteout conditions, equipment failures. He could survive this. He just needed to stay calm and think. First, assess the damage. His left ankle was definitely broken. Possible other fractures, though nothing else felt as bad. Cuts and bruises all over, but no major bleeding. He wasn't going to bleed out. Second, find the phone. He craned his neck, scanning the slope above him. There, about 30 feet up, caught in some brush, he could see his backpack's orange fabric. 30 feet. It might as well have been 30 miles. Third, get warm. The sun was already behind the mountains, and shadows were creeping across the valley. Temperature would drop fast. Without shelter, without a fire, he'd be hypothermic within hours. Henrik dragged himself to a more sheltered spot between two large boulders, using his arms to pull his body while his broken leg dragged uselessly behind him. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain crashing through him, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. By the time he'd positioned himself in the slight protection the rocks offered, he was sweating despite the cold, his breathing ragged and harsh. He pulled his coat tighter and tried to think. The satellite phone would have been his salvation, but it was impossible to reach. Nobody knew where he was. His nearest neighbor was over 20 miles away, and he hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 months. Nobody was coming. "Well," Henrik said aloud, his voice strange in the vast silence, "this is a hell of a way to go." He thought about Maria, about his years in the cabin, about the wolves. At least he'd had that, those 5 incredible days. At least his last winter had contained something magical, something that reminded him why life was worth living. The temperature continued to drop. Henrik's shivers started, small at first, then increasingly violent. He knew the signs. Hypothermia was setting in, just like it had been setting in when he'd found those wolf pups. Full circle, he thought with grim humor. His eyes grew heavy. The pain in his leg faded to a distant throb. That was bad. That meant his body was shutting down, prioritizing core functions, abandoning the periphery. He slapped his face, trying to stay conscious, but it was getting harder, so much harder. "Come on, Henrik," he muttered. "Don't quit now." But his eyes closed anyway. The darkness pulled at him, seductive and warm despite the cold. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the wilderness, a soft padding of paws on stone. Close, very close. Henrik's eyes snapped open. At first he thought he was hallucinating, the cold playing tricks on his mind, conjuring images of salvation that didn't exist. But the shape, moving through the shadows, was real. Large, white, moving with purpose toward his position. The mother wolf. Henrik's breath caught in his throat. She emerged from the darkening forest like a ghost, her white fur luminous in the dying light. And behind her, 2 younger wolves, larger now than when he'd last seen them but still not fully grown. Kajsa and her sibling. They'd found him. The mother wolf approached cautiously, her nose working, reading the scent of blood and pain and fear. She stopped about 10 feet away, her amber eyes fixed on Henrik's face. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then she did something that made Henrik's heart skip a beat. She circled him, not once but repeatedly, her paws leaving clear tracks in the snow and dirt around where he lay. The 2 younger wolves joined her, all 3 of them creating a deliberate pattern, a circle, around and around Henrik's position. "What are you doing?" Henrik whispered, confused, his mind still foggy from cold and pain. The mother wolf stopped, looked directly at him one more time, then turned and loped back into the forest. The 2 juveniles hesitated, looking back at Henrik with those familiar amber eyes, before following their mother into the darkness. And then he was alone again. No, not alone. Henrik suddenly understood what they'd done, the tracks, the circles. They were marking his position, creating a visible pattern that anyone searching from above would see, a signal. "You're trying to help me," he breathed, amazement cutting through the cold. "You're trying to save me." But who would see the tracks? Who would be searching? Henrik had no illusions. No one was looking for him. No one even knew he was missing. Unless... His mind was getting fuzzy again, thoughts slipping away like water through his fingers. But one thing was clear. The wolves had tried. They'd come to him in his moment of need, just as he'd come to them. The debt was being repaid. Henrik's eyes closed again. This time, he didn't fight it. If this was the end, at least he wouldn't die alone. The wolves had been here. They'd tried. That was enough. Henrik had no idea how much time passed. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together in a haze of cold and pain. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware of the rocks around him, sometimes lost in dreams of his cabin, of Maria, of white wolves running through endless snow. Then, sound, mechanical, rhythmic, growing louder. A helicopter. Henrik's eyes cracked open. The world was dark now, true night, but above him, cutting through the blackness, was a searchlight sweeping across the mountainside. "Here!" he tried to shout, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "I'm here!" The searchlight passed over him once, twice, then stopped and swung back, pinning him in brilliant white light. The helicopter hovered above, and Henrik could see figures moving inside. A radio crackled, voices sharp and professional. "We've got him. Subject located. Deploying. Rescue team!" Within minutes, 2 paramedics in orange rescue gear were rappelling down to his position. They moved with practiced efficiency, one immediately checking his vitals, while the other assessed his injuries. "Henrik Coleman?" one of them asked, a young woman with kind eyes. "That's me," Henrik managed. "You're going to be okay, sir. We're going to get you out of here." As they worked, stabilizing his leg, wrapping him in thermal blankets, preparing him for extraction, Henrik found his voice. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Nobody knew where I was." The female paramedic looked at him strangely. "We got a call from the park ranger station. Some hikers reported seeing something unusual from the air earlier today. They were in a private plane, doing scenic flights." "What did they see?" "Animal tracks. Wolf tracks, specifically. They said the pattern was bizarre, like the wolves had circled one spot over and over, deliberately. The rangers thought it might indicate an animal in distress, possibly caught in a trap, so they sent us to investigate." She paused, adjusting the IV she'd inserted into Henrik's arm. They weren't expecting to find a person. The tracks were, well, they looked intentional, like someone had trained the wolves to mark a location. But that's impossible, of course. Henrik closed his eyes, feeling tears freeze on his cheeks. "Not impossible," he whispered. "Not impossible at all." They lifted him into the helicopter, the rotor wash blasting snow and debris in all directions. As they rose into the air, Henrik looked down at the spot where he'd nearly died. In the searchlight's beam, he could see them clearly. Perfect circles worn into the snow and dirt, overlapping patterns that could only have been deliberate. A message written in the universal language of survival. "Help him! He helped us!" And at the edge of the clearing, just visible in the darkness, 3 white shapes stood watching. The mother wolf and her 2 juveniles, bearing witness to the rescue they'd made possible. Henrik raised one hand in salute, knowing they couldn't see it, not caring. The helicopter banked and turned, carrying him away toward lights and civilization and survival. But his heart remained behind in the wilderness, with 3 white wolves who'd understood something that transcended species and instinct. Debt, gratitude, love. Henrik spent 3 weeks in the regional hospital in Fairbanks, the largest city within 200 miles of his cabin. The doctors had been shocked by his condition when the helicopter delivered him. Severe hypothermia, a compound fracture of the left ankle, 2 cracked ribs, multiple lacerations, and the beginning stages of frostbite on his fingers and toes. "You're extraordinarily lucky to be alive," his surgeon told him after the operation to repair his ankle. "Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Lucky? Henrik supposed that was one word for it. Miraculous was another. He didn't tell anyone about the wolves. When the park rangers came to interview him about the incident, asking how he'd ended up in that particular location, he gave them the simple truth. He'd been hiking, slipped on loose rock, and fell. They asked about the circular tracks the hikers had reported. Henrik shrugged. Wolves are curious animals. Maybe they came to investigate after I fell. The rangers exchanged glances but didn't push. One of them, an older man named Dutch, who'd worked in the Arctic for 30 years, lingered after his partner left. "You know," Dutch said quietly, leaning against the doorframe of Henrik's hospital room, "I've been tracking wolves my whole career. Never seen a pattern quite like what those hikers photographed. Almost looked deliberate, like someone trained them." Henrik met his eyes steadily. "Wolves can't be trained to do something like that." "No," Dutch agreed. "They can't. But they can remember kindness. They can understand debt." He paused. "I read your research papers back in the day, before you retired. You always said wolves were smarter than we gave them credit for." Henrik said nothing. Dutch nodded slowly. "Whatever happened out there, I'm glad you made it back. The Arctic doesn't give up its secrets easily, and maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried." He left without another word. The ankle required surgery, metal pins and plates, and weeks of painful physical therapy. Henrik pushed himself harder than his doctors recommended, determined to walk again without a limp, determined to return to his life in the wilderness. But the hospital stay gave him too much time to think. For 17 years, he'd been hiding in that cabin, running from grief, from memories of Maria, from a world that had taken away the person he loved most. The isolation had been both punishment and protection, a way to exist without truly living. The wolves had changed that. They'd reminded him that connections mattered, that helping others, even at great personal risk, was what separated existing from living. They'd given him purpose again, and in return, they'd given him back his life. He couldn't waste that gift. On his 4th week in the hospital, Henrik made a decision. He called his estranged daughter Rebecca, whom he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Dad?" "Hi, Becca," Henrik said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite control. There was a long pause, then, "Are you okay? You never call." "I'm in the hospital. Nothing life-threatening," he added quickly as he heard her sharp intake of breath. "I had an accident while hiking. Broke my ankle." "Jesus, Dad, when?" "About a month ago." "A month?" Her voice rose. "And you're just now calling me?" "I know. I'm sorry. I've been a terrible father." Another pause, longer this time. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was softer. "What happened out there? And don't give me the sanitized version." So Henrik told her, not everything, but enough. The storm, the wolf pups, the mother's trust, the accident, the rescue. He didn't mention the circular tracks or the deliberate marking. Some things were too strange, too precious to share, even with family. But he told her the important part. "I almost died out there, Becca, and in that moment, all I could think about was how much I'd wasted, how much time I'd thrown away hiding from life because I was afraid of being hurt again." He heard her crying softly on the other end. "Mom wouldn't have wanted this for you," Rebecca said. "She always said you had too much love in you to waste it on solitude." She was right. She usually was. They talked for 2 hours, catching up on 3 years of silence. Rebecca told him about her job as a veterinarian in Anchorage, about her partner Sarah, about their plans to maybe adopt a child someday. Henrik told her about his daily life, his research, the beauty and brutality of the Arctic. And he told her he wanted to do better. Be better. When they finally hung up, Henrik felt lighter than he had in years. By mid-June, Henrik was cleared to leave the hospital. His ankle was healing well, though he'd need a cane for several more months. Rebecca offered to let him stay with her in Anchorage while he recovered, but Henrik declined gently. "I need to go home," he told her. "The cabin is where I belong. Promise me you'll get a better emergency communication system, she made him swear, and that you'll check in with me weekly. I promise. She drove him back to his cabin herself, a 9-hour journey through increasingly remote territory. As they pulled up to the small log structure, Henrik felt a surge of emotion. It looked exactly the same but somehow different, like seeing an old friend after years apart. It's so isolated, Rebecca said, staring at the endless forest surrounding them. Doesn't it get lonely? Henrik thought about that. Sometimes, but there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I'm learning that difference again. Rebecca helped him settle back in, stocking his supplies, checking his equipment, making sure everything was in working order. She stayed for 2 days, and when she left, she hugged him tightly. I love you, Dad. Don't forget that. I love you too, Becca, and I won't, I promise. He stood on his porch, watching her truck disappear down the long dirt road, and for the first time in 17 years, he didn't feel abandoned. He felt connected. Summer in the Arctic was brief, but glorious. The sun barely set, creating endless twilight that bathed the world in golden light. Wildflowers bloomed across the tundra, and the forest came alive with birds and small mammals. Henrik spent his days slowly rebuilding his strength. He walked with his cane, gradually extending his range, relearning the trails around his cabin. His ankle ached constantly, a dull reminder of his near-death experience, but he pushed through the pain. And he looked for the wolves. Every day during his walks, he searched for signs. He found tracks occasionally, scat deposits, kill sites where they'd hunted caribou or hare. The pack was still in the area, still moving through their territory. But he never saw them. Part of him had hoped for a reunion, an acknowledgement of what had passed between them. But the rational part of his brain, the scientist in him, knew better. They were wild animals. They'd done what they'd done out of instinct, memory, perhaps some rudimentary understanding of reciprocity. They didn't owe him anything more. Still, he looked. One evening in late July, Henrik was sitting on his porch, watching the sunset that wasn't really a sunset, just a deepening of the golden light. He'd been reading, but his eyes kept drifting to the tree line, searching for movement that never came. He was about to go inside when he saw it, a flash of white among the trees. Henrik's heart leaped. He stood slowly, leaning on his cane, barely breathing. The mother wolf emerged from the forest. She was magnificent, her coat gleaming in the low-angle sunlight, her body powerful and healthy. The starving, desperate creature he'd sheltered had transformed into the apex predator she was meant to be. Behind her came her 2 juveniles, nearly adult-sized now, moving with the confident grace of young predators coming into their power. Henrik recognized Kaiser immediately by the slight marking above her left eye, now more pronounced as she'd grown. The 3 wolves stood at the edge of the clearing, about 50 yards from the cabin, and looked directly at him. Henrik's throat tightened with emotion he couldn't name. "Hello," he said softly, knowing they couldn't hear him at this distance, not caring. They stood there for a long moment, wolf and man, separated by species and instinct, but connected by something deeper. Something that transcended the normal boundaries between wild and tame. Then the mother wolf did something extraordinary. She sat, just lowered her haunches to the ground and sat, as if she were a domestic dog, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. The 2 juveniles followed her lead, sitting on either side of their mother. 3 white wolves, sitting in perfect formation, watching Henrik with amber eyes that seemed to glow in the golden light. "Thank you," Henrik called out, his voice breaking. "Thank you for saving my life." The mother wolf's ears pricked forward at his voice. She stood, and for a heartbeat, Henrik thought she might approach. But instead she turned and began trotting back toward the tree line. The juveniles hesitated. Kaiser took a few steps forward, closer to the cabin, her head tilted in what looked like curiosity. Her sibling followed. The mother stopped and looked back, a clear summons. The juveniles paused, looking between their mother and Henrik, torn between 2 worlds. Finally, Kaiser made a soft, chuffing sound, almost like a farewell, and turned to follow her mother. Her sibling did the same. Within moments, all three had vanished into the forest as completely as if they'd never been there. Henrik stood on his porch until the light finally faded and stars emerged in the vast Arctic sky. His chest felt full, aching with a strange mixture of joy and loss. He'd been given a gift beyond measure, a glimpse into something sacred, a connection that most people would never experience in their lifetimes. The debt was settled. The circle was complete. And yet, Henrik had the strangest feeling
That this wasn't really the end, that the wilderness, in its infinite wisdom, had more in store for him.
August brought warmer weather and longer expeditions. Henrik's ankle had healed enough that he could hike without the cane for short distances, though he always carried it just in case. He ventured further from the cabin, exploring areas he hadn't visited in months. One afternoon, following a game trail he'd used dozens of times before, Henrik noticed something unusual. Fresh tracks, large canine prints pressed into the soft earth near a stream. But these weren't just any tracks. They were enormous, larger than any wolf tracks he'd ever seen. Henrik knelt down, his scientific training kicking in automatically. He measured the print with his hand, estimating size and weight. The track was nearly 6 inches across, significantly larger than normal Arctic wolf prints. And there was something else. The track was accompanied by smaller prints, juvenile-sized, but moving in a specific
Pattern around the larger tracks, a family group, but something was off about them.
Henrik followed the tracks, his curiosity overriding his caution. They led him about a mile upstream, through increasingly dense forest, until he reached a small clearing he'd never seen before. What he found there made him stop dead in his tracks. A den. A large, well-used wolf den, carved into the side of a small hill, its entrance partially hidden by brush and fallen trees. And scattered around the entrance were bones, picked clean and sun-bleached. Caribou, primarily, but also smaller prey. This was an active den site, a successful one. Henrik approached cautiously, making noise to avoid surprising any occupants. But the den appeared empty, the wolves likely out hunting during the daylight hours. He was about to leave when something caught his eye. On the ground near the den entrance, partially covered by dirt and debris, was something that didn't belong. A piece of fabric. Bright orange fabric.
Henrik's blood ran cold.
He recognized that orange. It was the same shade as emergency rescue gear, as his own jacket that he'd left behind during his accident. He knelt down and carefully uncovered the fabric. It was indeed from a jacket, torn and dirty, but unmistakably human in origin. And wrapped inside it was something that made Henrik's heart nearly stop. His walking stick, the one he'd lost during his fall. The wolves had taken it, brought it back to their den. Henrik sat back on his heels, his mind racing. This wasn't normal wolf behavior. Wolves didn't collect human artifacts. They didn't keep souvenirs. Unless... A sound behind him made Henrik spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray on his belt. The mother wolf stood at the edge of the clearing, flanked by her 2 juveniles. They'd returned while he'd been investigating their den. Henrik froze. He was in their territory, near their home, in the most vulnerable position possible. If they perceived him
As a threat, if they decided to defend their den site, he had no chance.
But the mother didn't attack. She didn't even growl. She walked past him, completely ignoring his presence, and disappeared into the den entrance. The 2 juveniles remained, watching Henrik with those unnerving amber eyes. After a moment, Kajsa approached. She moved slowly, deliberately, until she was close enough that Henrik could have touched her. She lowered her head and picked up the walking stick in her mouth. Then she dropped it at Henrik's feet. Henrik stared at the stick, then at the young wolf, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "You kept it," he whispered. "You've been keeping it." Kajsa made that soft chuffing sound again, then retreated to join her sibling. From inside the den came another sound, small, high-pitched whimpering. Puppies! The mother had given birth. Henrik's chest tightened with understanding. She'd brought him here deliberately. She'd led him to her den, to her new
Family. showing him the continuation of the line he'd helped save. The mother emerged from the den, and with her came 3 tiny white balls of fluff, stumbling on unsteady legs. New pups, probably only a few weeks old, their eyes still blue with youth. The mother wolf watched Henrik carefully as her pups explored the den entrance, supervised by their older siblings. She was showing him trust again, the ultimate trust a wild predator could offer. "Look what your kindness created," she seemed to be saying. "Look what survived because of you." Henrik felt tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. "They're beautiful," he managed to say. "All of them." He stayed for another hour, sitting quietly at a respectful distance, watching the pack interact. The mother grooming her pups, the juveniles playing gently with their younger siblings. A family, whole and thriving, against all odds. When the sun began to sink lower, Henrik stood carefully, using his recovered walking stick for support. "Thank you for showing me this," he said to the mother wolf. "I promise I'll never tell anyone about this place. Your secret is safe with me." The mother wolf regarded him for a long moment, then did something that made Henrik's breath catch. She dipped her head, just slightly, just once, an acknowledgement. Then she turned her attention back to her pups, dismissing him as cleanly as if he'd ceased to exist. Henrik walked back to his cabin in a daze, his mind spinning with the impossibility of what he'd witnessed. A wild animal showing gratitude, trust, even something that looked remarkably like friendship. Science couldn't explain it. Biology textbooks didn't account for it. But it had happened. It was real. And it meant that everything Henrik thought he knew about the boundaries between wild and human, between animal and person, was wrong. Or perhaps, he thought as he reached his cabin and looked back at the vast wilderness, perhaps those boundaries had never existed at all. Perhaps they were just stories humans told themselves to feel less alone in an infinite universe. Perhaps connection was possible anywhere, with anything, if you were brave enough to reach across the divide. Late August brought unexpected visitors to Henrik's remote cabin. He was outside chopping firewood when he heard the sound of an engine approaching. Rare enough that he stopped mid-swing, setting down his axe to wait and see who could possibly be driving out here. A Park Service truck emerged from the trees, and Henrik recognized the driver immediately. Dutch, the ranger who'd interviewed him in the hospital. But Dutch wasn't alone. A younger woman sat in the passenger seat, and as they parked, Henrik saw the logo on her jacket. Wildlife Services. "Henrik Coleman?" the woman called out as they approached. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, wildlife biologist with the National Park Service. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Henrik's stomach tightened. "Of course. Come on up to the porch." Once they were settled, Dr. Chen got straight to business. "We've been tracking an unusual wolf pack in this area. The alpha female and her offspring have displayed some remarkable behaviors that don't fit normal patterns." "What kind of behaviors?" Henrik asked carefully. "Intelligence beyond what we typically see, problem solving, and," she hesitated, "what appears to be deliberate interaction with human structures and trails." Dutch leaned forward. "We're not here to cause trouble, Henrik, but we've received multiple reports of wolves approaching hikers without aggression, of tracks that seem intentionally placed, of behavior that suggests prior positive human contact." Henrik's heart pounded. "You think someone's been feeding them?" "Or more," Dr. Chen said. "The tracking data shows the pack's territory centers around this area, your cabin specifically." There was a long silence. "I'm not asking you to break any laws," Dr. Chen continued, "but if you have information about these animals, it could help us protect them. There's been talk of relocation, of intervention. I'd rather not see that happen if it's not necessary." Henrik made a decision. "Last winter," he said slowly, "during that big storm in December, I found 2 wolf pups on my porch. They were dying of hypothermia." He told them the story. Not all of it, but enough. The rescue, the mother's arrival, the 5 days together, the storm. He showed them the box with the shed fur, the only physical evidence he'd kept. When he finished, Dutch and Dr. Chen exchanged glances. That explains a lot, Dr. Chen said quietly. The pack's behavior, the trust they've shown, even the incident with your rescue. Are they in danger? Henrik asked. Will they be relocated? Dr. Chen shook her head. Not if I can help it. This is actually extraordinary data. A wild pack that's learned to coexist with human presence without becoming dependent or aggressive. It's exactly the kind of thing conservation science needs to understand. She stood to leave, then paused. Mr. Coleman, would you be willing to participate in a long-term observation study? Nothing invasive, just documentation of any interactions, behavioral notes, that sort of thing. Henrik considered. It meant opening his private world to scrutiny. It meant sharing his wolves with the scientific community. But it also meant protecting them, ensuring they could continue to thrive in their territory without interference. Yes, he said, I'll help, on one condition. What's that? The den site remains secret, exact coordinates never published. They deserve some privacy. Dr. Chen smiled. Agreed. Their safety comes first. After they left, Henrik sat on his porch, thought about what it meant. His story, his wolves, were no longer just his. They belonged to something bigger now, to the broader understanding of what was possible between species. Maybe that was how it should be. Maybe some miracles were meant to be shared. Autumn arrived with a vengeance, painting the tundra in brilliant shades of gold and crimson before stripping it bare for winter's return. Henrik's ankle had healed as well as it was going to, leaving him with only a slight limp and the occasional ache when storms approached. But something else had changed, something deeper than physical healing. For the first time in 17 years, Henrik had purpose beyond mere survival. Dr. Chen's observation study gave structure to his days. He documented every wolf sighting, every track, every behavioral pattern he could observe from a respectful distance. He took photographs with the camera the Park Service had provided, filled notebooks with detailed observations, and submitted monthly reports. The data he was collecting was groundbreaking. The pack's continued success, their ability to raise healthy pups while maintaining their wild nature despite regular human proximity, challenged conventional wisdom about wolf behavior and habituation. Your work is going to change conservation policy, Dr. Chen told him during one of her quarterly visits. We're seeing evidence that coexistence is possible if approached correctly, with respect and clear boundaries. Henrik felt pride in that. But more than pride, he felt grateful. The wolves had given him back his life, and now he could give something back to them. Protection through understanding. Rebecca visited more frequently now, making the long drive from Anchorage every few months. She brought supplies, news from the outside world, and something Henrik had forgotten he needed: family. During her October visit, she arrived with surprising news. "Dad," she said over dinner, her hands nervously fidgeting with her coffee cup. "Sarah and we've been approved for adoption. We're going to have a daughter." Henrik felt his throat tighten. "Becca, that's wonderful." "There's more," she continued. "We'd like to name her Maria, after Mom, if that's okay with you." The tears came before Henrik could stop them. He reached across the table and took his daughter's hands. "Your mother would be honored. I'm honored. We want you to be in her life, Dad, really in it, not just occasional visits. She should know her grandfather." Henrik nodded, unable to speak. Another connection, another thread tying him back to the world of the living. Another reason to keep going, to keep trying, to keep being better. That night, after Rebecca had gone to bed in the cabin's small guest room, Henrik stood on his porch and looked out at the star-filled sky. The northern lights were dancing, green and purple curtains of light rippling across the heavens. "I wish you could see this, Maria," he whispered to the night. "We're going to have a granddaughter. She's going to carry your name." The forest was silent, but Henrik felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Maybe Maria was seeing it, somehow. Maybe she'd always been watching, waiting for him to find his way back to life. Maybe she'd sent the wolves. The thought was fanciful, unscientific, completely unlike his usual rational mind. But standing there under the aurora, Henrik allowed himself to believe it anyway. Winter's return. November brought the first serious snows, and with them a familiar pattern. The days grew shorter, the temperatures plummeted, and the wilderness settled into its long winter sleep. Henrik was better prepared this year. His supplies were stocked, his equipment maintained, and most importantly, he had people checking on him. Rebecca called weekly via his new satellite phone. Dr. Chen sent regular emails. Even Dutch stopped by occasionally, ostensibly to check on research conditions, but really just to make sure Henrik was alive and well. He wasn't alone anymore, even when he was alone. The wolves adapted to winter as they always did, their thick white coats providing perfect camouflage against the snow. Henrik saw them less frequently as prey became scarce and the pack ranged further in search of food. But they still passed by his cabin regularly, leaving tracks in the fresh snow like signatures in a guest book. One morning in early December, almost exactly a year after he'd first found the pups, Henrik discovered something unusual. A line of tracks leading directly to his cabin, stopping at the porch, then continuing back into the forest. Someone had visited during the night. He followed the tracks, curious, and found something left at the base of a tree, about 50 yards from his cabin. At first, he thought it was just another kill site, remnants of a meal. But as he got closer, he realized it was something else. A gift. The hindquarter of a caribou, relatively fresh, placed deliberately where Henrik would find it. The wolves had left him food. Henrik stood there in the snow, staring at the meat, and felt his eyes burn with tears. They were still taking care of him, even now, even when he no longer needed it. The circle continued to spiral outward, connection feeding connection, kindness begetting kindness. He took the meat back to his cabin, processed it properly, and that night ate caribou stew while watching the snow fall outside his window. The meat tasted like wilderness and survival, and something he could only describe as love. The sickness. January arrived with bitter cold and shorter days, but also with troubling news. Dr. Chen called, her voice tight with worry. "Henrik, we've had reports of a wolf pack about 30 miles south of your position, showing signs of disease. Mange, possibly distemper. If it spreads to your pack." "How bad is it?" Henrik asked, his stomach sinking. "Bad. We've already lost 3 animals. The rest of that pack is in quarantine observation, but these things spread fast. I'm sending you information on symptoms to watch for. If you see anything unusual, call immediately." Henrik spent the next weeks hyper-vigilant, watching for any signs of illness in his wolves. He knew the statistics. Canine distemper was devastating to wild wolf populations, with mortality rates up to 90%. If his pack contracted it, especially the young pups, they might not survive. He increased his observation rounds, pushing himself through the brutal cold, despite his still healing ankle. Every day he searched for tracks, for scat, for any indication of the pack's health. For 3 weeks, everything seemed fine. The tracks looked normal, the scat was healthy. The occasional glimpses he caught of the pack showed no obvious signs of distress. Then, on a grey morning in late January, Henrik found Kajsa. She was lying in the snow about a mile from his cabin, barely moving. Even from a distance he could see something was wrong. Her coat looked dull, her body was thin, and she was trembling violently. Henrik's heart dropped into his stomach. He approached slowly, talking softly, expecting her to flee or show aggression. But she didn't move, just watched him with those amber eyes, now clouded with fever. Up close the symptoms were obvious: discharge from her nose and eyes, labored breathing, the characteristic tremors of distemper's neurological phase. "Oh no," Henrik breathed. "Not you, please, not you." Kajsa whimpered softly, a sound of pure misery. Henrik's mind raced through options. He could call Dr. Chen, get veterinary help, but by the time anyone arrived, it would likely be too late. Distemper moved fast in its final stages. He could leave her, let nature take its course. It was what protocol demanded, what wildlife management guidelines required. Don't interfere. Let the wild remain wild. But looking at this young wolf who'd trusted him, who'd helped save his life, who'd pressed her small head into his palm as a frightened pup, Henrik knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't watch her die. "I'm going to help you," he told her, "if you'll let me." He went back to his cabin as fast as his limp would allow and grabbed emergency supplies: a sled, blankets, his medical kit, and the satellite phone. When he returned, Kaiser hadn't moved. She watched him approach with what looked like resignation. She knew she was dying. "Not if I can help it," Henrik muttered. He called Dr. Chen first. "I've got a sick wolf. Kaiser, the juvenile female I told you about. Definitely distemper, late stage. Henrik, you know the protocol. I'm bringing her to my cabin. I'm going to try to treat her." "That's illegal. If Fish and Wildlife finds out." "Let them. I didn't save her life twice to let her die in the snow now." There was a pause. Then Dr. Chen said quietly, "What do you need?" "Antibiotics for secondary infections."
"Fluids. Anti-seizure medication, if you have it. Can you get supplies to me? I'll have a helicopter there in 4 hours. Henrik, the survival rate for late-stage distemper is almost 0. "I know, but I have to try." He ended the call and turned to Kaiser. "Okay, girl, this is going to hurt, but we're going to get you somewhere warm." With immense care, Henrik lifted the young wolf onto the sled. She was startlingly light, weakened by days of illness. She didn't struggle, just lay there passively as he wrapped her in blankets and began the slow journey back to his cabin. It was the longest mile of Henrik's life. The vigil. Henrik set up a quarantine area in his back room, the same room where he'd nursed the pups a year ago. He lined it with clean blankets, set up a space heater, and carefully transferred Kaiser to the makeshift bed. She lay there, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Henrik started treatment immediately, following every bit of veterinary knowledge he'd accumulated over his career. He cleaned her eyes and nose, forcing fluids into her when she could swallow, monitoring her temperature constantly. When the helicopter arrived with supplies from Dr. Chen, he added antibiotics to fight secondary bacterial infections and anti-seizure medication to control the tremors racking her body. Then he did the only thing left to do. He waited. The first night was the worst. Kaiser's fever spiked to dangerous levels, and the seizures came in waves. Henrik stayed by her side through all of it, cooling her with damp cloths, keeping her comfortable, talking to her constantly. "You're going to make it," he told her. "You survived the cold as a pup. You learned to hunt and thrive. You helped save my life. This isn't how your story ends." By the second day, Kaiser's condition hadn't improved, but it hadn't worsened either. She remained in a fever-induced stupor, occasionally opening her eyes to look at Henrik before closing them again. On the third day, something changed. Henrik was dozing in his chair next to her bed when he heard it, a soft, lapping sound. He opened his eyes to find Kaiser drinking from the water bowl he'd placed nearby. "That's it," he encouraged, his voice rough with exhaustion and hope. "Keep drinking." She managed a few more laps before collapsing back onto the blankets, but her eyes were clearer, more focused. By the fourth day, she was eating small amounts of food. By the fifth, she could lift her head without assistance. The fever broke on the sixth day. Henrik watched her temperature return to normal, watched the tremors subside, watched life return to those amber eyes, and felt something break open in his chest. She was going to survive. Against all odds, against veterinary statistics and natural law, this young wolf was going to live. On the seventh day, Henrik opened the back door to his cabin and found the mother wolf and her remaining pack members sitting in the snow, waiting. They'd known. Somehow, they'd known their packmate was here, that Henrik was helping her. The mother wolf looked at Henrik, and in her eyes, he saw the same desperate trust she'd shown a year ago when she'd come to retrieve her pups. "She's going to be okay," Henrik called out. "She's going to make it." The mother wolf stood and walked closer, stopping just at the edge of the porch. She looked past Henrik into the cabin, as if trying to see her daughter. Then she did something that made Henrik's breath catch. She touched her nose to Henrik's hand, just for a moment. A gesture of trust, of gratitude, of something that transcended the boundaries between their species. Then she turned and vanished into the forest with the rest of the pack. The twist. 2 weeks later, Kaiser was strong enough to move around the cabin with increasing confidence. Her appetite had returned, her coat was regaining its luster, and the neurological symptoms had almost completely resolved. Henrik knew it was nearly time to release her back to her pack. The thought filled him with a strange mixture of relief and sadness, relief that she'd survived, sadness that this temporary connection would end. One afternoon, while Kaiser was sleeping peacefully in her quarantine room, Henrik was organizing his old research files when he came across a box he hadn't opened in years. It was labeled in Maria's handwriting, "Personal, 1989 to 1992. Curious, Henrik opened it. Inside were journals, photographs, and letters from Maria's early years before they'd met. He'd never read through these carefully, had been too painful after her death. But now, with time and healing creating distance from grief, he began to read. Most of it was mundane, daily observations from her work as a field researcher in Alaska's interior, notes on bird migrations, weather patterns, camping logistics. Then he found an entry dated December 15th, 1991, and his blood ran cold. Today I experienced something I can't quite explain scientifically, though I'll try. I was slow-showing about 5 miles from base camp when I fell through thin ice covering a stream. Hypothermia set in quickly. I managed to drag myself to shore, but I was in bad shape. That's when they came. 3 wolves, a large male and 2 younger animals. They didn't attack. Instead, they lay down around me, sharing their body heat. They stayed with me for hours, through the worst of it, until I was strong enough to build a fire. When the rescue team finally found me the next morning, the wolves were gone. But their tracks were everywhere, circling my position like a beacon. The rangers said the pattern was so obvious from the air that they couldn't miss it. I've spent my entire career studying wildlife, and I've never heard of behavior like this. It's as if they understood I needed help, as if they chose to save me. Maybe I'm anthropomorphizing. Maybe it was just coincidence and curious animal behavior. But I don't think so. I felt something that night, lying in the snow, surrounded by wolves. A connection. An understanding that went beyond species and survival instinct. I'm going to spend the rest of my career trying to understand what happened. Because if animals can show compassion, true compassion, toward another species, it changes everything we think we know about consciousness and empathy. I named the largest wolf in my notes, the one who seemed to be the leader. I called him Ghost because he appeared when I needed him most and vanished like a spirit when I was safe. I'll never forget what they did for me. I'll never forget that debt. Henrik read the entry 3 times, his hands shaking. Maria had been saved by wolves. 35 years ago, in almost exactly the same circumstances as his own rescue, wolves had saved his wife's life. He flipped through more pages, finding sketches Maria had made of the wolves. Detailed anatomical drawings, behavioral notes, attempts to understand what she'd experienced.
And then he found it. A photograph, faded and yellowed with age. Maria, in her research gear, smiling at the camera. And in the background, barely visible in the tree line, a white shape. A white wolf. Henrik's mind reeled. The chances of this being coincidence were astronomical. Arctic wolves lived for 7 to 10 years in the wild. The wolves that saved Maria couldn't possibly be the same animals he'd encountered. But what if they were related? What if the behavior, the compassion, the understanding of reciprocal altruism had been passed down through generations? What if helping humans was somehow encoded in this particular pack's culture? Learned behavior transmitted from mother to offspring across decades? Henrik sat down heavily, the journal still open in his lap. Everything clicked into place with sudden, crystalline clarity. Maria had dedicated her later career to studying wolf-human interactions, had advocated for conservation policies that protected wolf territories and promoted
coexistence.
She'd never told him the full story of why, had always just said she understood something about wolves that others didn't. Now he knew. She'd carried this secret, this impossible connection for decades, and when Henrik had stumbled into his own encounter with wolves, when he'd been saved by them just as she had been, it wasn't coincidence. It was continuation. It was legacy. It was the same pack, or their descendants, maintaining a relationship with humans that had begun before Henrik was even aware of it. His wife had been part of this story all along, and now, so was he. Henrik stood and walked to the back room where Kajsa slept. He looked at this young wolf, recovering from a disease that should have killed her, and saw not just an animal, but a living thread connecting past to present to future. "Your grandmother," Henrik whispered, "or great-great-grandmother, saved my wife's life, and now I've helped save yours." Maria would have loved knowing this. She would have understood. Kajsa opened one amber eye and looked at him with what almost seemed like knowing. Maybe she did understand. Maybe that understanding was exactly what made these wolves different, special, worthy of the protection and respect Henrik had dedicated his life to providing. He returned to his desk and began writing. Not a research report, but a personal account. The story of Maria's rescue, his own experiences, and everything he'd learned about this remarkable pack that seemed to bridge the gap between wild and human in ways science struggled to explain. This wasn't just data anymore. This was legacy. This was meaning. And it needed to be preserved. Release. 3 weeks after finding Kajsa sick in the snow, Henrik made the decision to release her. She was fully recovered, strong and healthy, pacing the back room with increasing restlessness. She needed to return to her pack, to her wild life. He opened the back door early one morning before dawn and stepped aside. "You're free to go," he told her. "Your family is waiting." Kajsa hesitated in the doorway, looking between Henrik and the forest beyond. Then she did something that made Henrik's throat tight. She walked over to him and pressed her head against his leg, just as she had as a pup, a gesture of affection, of gratitude, of goodbye. "I'll miss you too," Henrik said, running his hand gently over her head. "Stay safe out there." Kajsa pulled away and trotted out into the snow. At the tree line, the rest of her pack was waiting. Her mother, her sibling, and the 3 younger pups, now growing strong and healthy. The reunion was joyful and immediate. The pack surrounded Kajsa, touching noses, pressing against her, reaffirming bonds that Henrik's intervention had threatened, but not broken. The mother wolf looked back at Henrik one last time. Then, as a family, they turned and disappeared into the forest. Henrik stood on his porch, watching the space where they'd vanished, feeling the familiar ache of letting go mixed with the warm certainty of having done the right thing. Spring's promise. April brought Rebecca back to the cabin, but this time she wasn't alone. Henrik opened his door to find his daughter holding a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Inside, a tiny face with dark eyes and wispy hair looked up at him with newborn wonder. "Dad," Rebecca said softly, "meet your granddaughter. Meet Maria." Henrik took the baby in his arms with trembling hands, this small life carrying his wife's name, representing the future he'd once thought he'd lost. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I have so many stories to tell you." They spent a week at the cabin, Rebecca and Sarah and baby Maria, filling the small space with life and noise and laughter. Henrik showed them his research, told them about the wolves, shared Maria's journal entries about her own rescue. "It's like Mom knew," Rebecca said, reading her mother's words. "Like she was preparing you for this somehow." "Maybe she was," Henrik agreed. "Maybe she knew that some connections transcend death, that love and purpose find ways to continue even after we think they've ended." On their last evening before returning to Anchorage, Henrik took Rebecca outside to watch the sunset. The Arctic spring was gentle, with long twilight hours and the first hints of green returning to the tundra. "I want Maria to grow up knowing this place," Rebecca said, "knowing about her grandmother, about the wolves, about everything you've learned here." "She will," Henrik promised. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got too much to live for now." As if summoned by his words, movement at the tree line caught his eye. The wolf pack, all 7 of them now, stood watching the cabin. "Look," Henrik said softly, pointing. Rebecca gasped. "Dad, they're beautiful." The mother wolf sat down, and one by one, the others followed her lead. 7 white wolves, sitting in perfect formation, watching the humans who'd become part of their story. "Baby," Maria gurgled in Rebecca's arms, waving tiny fists at the world. And in that moment, Henrik felt the circle complete itself, one final time. Past and present and future, all connected. Maria's rescue, leading to Henrik's connection, leading to his granddaughter's awareness of the wild world and its possibilities. Legacy wasn't just about genetics. It was about the stories we passed down, the connections we maintained, the bridges we built between impossible things. The wolves stood and began to move away, but before they vanished, Kaiser looked back one last time. Henrik raised his hand in farewell, and he could have sworn she dipped her head in acknowledgement. Then they were gone, melting into the wilderness like the spirits they'd always been. Epilogue. 5 years later. Henrik Coleman sat on his porch, now in his mid-70s, watching his 5-year-old granddaughter play in the snow. Maria, little Maria as they called her, was making snow angels and laughing with pure joy. Behind him, Rebecca and Sarah were preparing dinner in the cabin, their voices mixing with the crackling of the wood stove and the scent of cooking food. This had become their routine, regular visits, sometimes weeks long, where 3 generations shared the cabin and the wilderness that had shaped them all. Little Maria looked up suddenly, her attention caught by something at the tree line. "Grandpa, look, the wolves!" Henrik followed her gaze and smiled. The pack had grown over the years, with new pups born each spring, but he could still identify the originals. The mother, now graying around her muzzle but still strong, and Kaiser, fully mature and with pups of her own. "Remember what I taught you," Henrik called to his granddaughter. "We watch, we respect, but we don't approach." "I know, Grandpa, they're wild, but they're also our friends, right?" Henrik considered that. Friends was too simple a word for what these wolves represented. They were teachers, survivors, symbols of what was possible when compassion transcended species boundaries. "There's something special," he said, "something rare, and it's our job to make sure they stay safe and wild for a very long time." Little Maria nodded seriously, already understanding at 5 what some people never learned in their lifetimes. The wolves watched for a few more minutes, then turned and vanished into the forest, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow. Inside the cabin, Henrik's latest research paper sat on his desk, nearly finished. It was a comprehensive analysis of multi-generational wolf behavior, documenting decades of interactions between one pack and the humans in their territory. Dr. Chen had already told him it would be published in the top wildlife journal, that universities were interested in his data, that his work was changing how scientists understood animal cognition and interspecies relationships. But more important than any publication, Henrik knew he'd preserved something precious. Maria's story and his own, intertwined with the story of wolves who'd chosen compassion over instinct, connection over isolation. That evening after dinner, Henrik read to little Maria from the journal he'd been keeping. Not the dry scientific observations, but the personal narrative. The story of how love and loss and unexpected grace had transformed a bitter old man into someone with purpose and joy. "And they all lived happily ever after?" little Maria asked, as children always did. Henrik smiled. "Not happily ever after, just happily, for as long as they could, and that's enough." He looked out the window at the Arctic night, at the stars blazing overhead, at the vast wilderness that had given him back his life. Somewhere out there, the wolves were hunting, teaching their young, surviving another day in the endless cycle of life and death that governed the wild. And tomorrow, Henrik would wake up and do his part to ensure they could continue that cycle for generations to come. It was enough. It was.
More than enough. It was everything.